You gotta understand, Karl wasn't just old, he was weathered, like a piece of driftwood the ocean couldn't quite give up on. He was pushing 60-something, maybe closer to 70, with a thick mane of gray hair that hadn't seen a barber in months and a beard that felt like steel wool. He always wore that darn plaid shirt and those faded denim overalls, looking every bit the farmer he was. But lately, Karl wasn't farming much. He was mostly just existing. His little farm, tucked right up against the deep woods, was quiet, too quiet. The barn was sturdy, the fields were neatly tilled, but there was this overwhelming sense of absence, and you didn't have to look too hard to figure out why. Every evening, right as the sun started bleeding red and orange all over the horizon, Karl would sit on his porch, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, and he'd look at one specific spot, an old, sturdy horse paddock. The wood was solid, the latch was oiled, but the gate had been closed for 15 years. It wasn't just a paddock, it was a grave marker for a dream. 15 years back, his wife, Elara, a fiery woman with eyes the color of the summer sky, she'd been pregnant with their first, a late-in-life miracle, they called it. Karl had been building that paddock for the pony he promised their kid, but a freak snowstorm hit, cutting them off from the city hospital. Karl drove that old truck through drifts up to the headlights, but it wasn't enough. They lost both of them, his son, his Elara. The grief was a physical weight, like the whole farm had settled on his shoulders. Since then, Karl hadn't let a single living thing close to his heart. Not a dog, not a goat, not even a decent rooster. He worked the land, ate his beans, and slept. That was it. He sealed off the paddock and sealed off his heart, thinking that if nothing got in, nothing could ever leave. That was Karl's life, a routine of quiet, self-imposed isolation. He was surviving, but he sure as heck wasn't living. The only sound was the wind, which mostly just whispered about things he'd failed to do. But the silence, man, it was getting loud. It was one of those miserable late autumn days, the kind where the air is so cold it feels brittle, and the first few flakes of snow are spitting down, promising a hell of a storm. Karl was out checking his fence lines by the woods. The path was muddy, the light was failing, and he was ready to call it a day when he heard it. It wasn't a sound of the woods, not a deer, not a squirrel. It was thin, high-pitched, and weak, a noise that just screamed lost. Karl stopped dead. His old farmer instincts, buried deep under 15 years of grief, suddenly sparked. He walked toward the sound, pushing through a thicket of thorn bushes and wet, clinging branches. The mud was sucking at his worn leather boots. And then he saw it. Tucked up tight against the base of a fallen oak, barely visible under a dusting of fresh snow, lay a newborn foal. Its coat was still damp, matted with mud, and it was barely the size of a large dog. Its legs were spindly and useless. It lay there, panting shallowly, its eyes huge, dark, and already starting to glaze over with the cold. There was no sign of the mother, no tracks nearby that suggested she'd stayed. It looked like it had been there for hours, abandoned. Karl stood over it, the cold seeping into his bones, but he felt a different kind of chill, the chill of memory. That fragile, vulnerable life, it was the spitting image of his own tragedy. His first, gut-wrenching instinct was to turn away, to leave it to the woods. It was the safe choice. No risk, no pain. "I can't," he muttered, his voice roughened and used. "I just can't." He knelt down, the cold mud soaking his old denim overalls. He gently touched the foal's tiny, trembling flank. The little creature barely reacted. It was hours from death. Karl knew it. The only thing he had in his hand was his old, woolen plaid jacket he tied around his waist. He unwrapped it and, with the practiced, careful hands of a man who'd once held his world, he wrapped the tiny, dying life in his jacket. The heat was instantly absorbed by the freezing skin, and the foal let out a tiny, almost inaudible sigh. Karl scooped it up. It weighed nothing. It was all bone and cold air, carrying this fragile life through the darkening woods. The snow beginning to fall in earnest. Karl wasn't just walking back to his barn. He was carrying his own damn ghost. He was willingly, knowingly, bringing pain back into his quiet, organized existence. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the snow, that if this little thing died, it would be the final blow. But he couldn't leave it. Getting the foal, which Karl immediately started calling lucky, because it sure was lucky he'd found it, back to the barn was the easy part. The hard part was keeping the tiny thing alive. The moment he set the foal down in a freshly bedded stall, wrapped tight in an old, heavy horse blanket he hadn't touched in years, the tremors started again. Not just shivering, but deep, convulsive shakes that rattled its fragile bones. Karl didn't waste a second. He knew colic and he knew hypothermia. This was worse. He ran back to the house, his own little shack of silence, and started a furious fire in the old wood stove. He grabbed the last of the powdered milk he used for his coffee, a bottle of high-energy molasses he kept for his own weak moments, and he boiled a massive pot of water. He was moving with a speed and focus he hadn't felt since his youth. The silence of his farm was suddenly shattered by the clanking of pots and the frantic rhythm of a man fighting against time. Back in the barn, the stall felt like an operating room. Karl had hung an old hurricane lamp, casting long, nervous shadows on the wooden walls. The dim light only highlighted the hopelessness of the situation. Lucky, the little foal, was barely taking shallow breaths. Karl knew a newborn needed colostrum, the first milk, and he didn't have any. The powdered cow's milk and molasses mix was a poor substitute, a shot in the dark. He managed to pry the foal's mouth open, it was so small, and started dropping the warm, milky liquid in, drop by agonizing drop. Most of it just drooled out. The foal lacked the strength, the will, to suckle. "Come on, Lucky," Karl muttered, his face inches from the little creature's. His eyes, usually clouded with quiet sadness, were now laser-focused, desperate. "You gotta fight, boy. You gotta give me something to work with." This wasn't just about the foal's life anymore. This was a direct challenge to the grief that had consumed Karl. If he could save this life, maybe, just maybe, it would quiet the voice in his head that kept whispering, "You failed before. You'll fail again." He spent the whole first night wide awake, sitting right there in the cold straw, leaning against the sturdy wood of the stall. Every hour, he'd try the bottle. Every hour, he'd rub the foal's tiny legs, trying to get the blood moving. He'd even bring out his old, moth-eaten woolen hat and put it on the foal's head, which was absurd, but somehow it made him feel less useless. The next morning, the sun rose pale and cold, and Lucky was still alive. That was a victory. A small, shaky, maybe victory. But the real drama started when Karl realized he was running out of supplies. He needed proper vitamins, better formula, maybe even a veterinarian, a luxury Karl hadn't afforded himself since Alara died. His truck was old, the roads were getting icy, and the nearest town was miles away. Leaving the foal alone, even for 2 hours, felt like a betrayal. He made a difficult choice. He wrapped Lucky as tightly as he dared, tucked him deep into the straw, and rigged up a heat lamp he'd found in the dusty storage room. "Don't move, you hear me?" he whispered to the foal, knowing full well it didn't understand. The drive to town was a terrifying blur. Karl pushed his old truck harder than he should have, the icy pavement a constant threat. He finally got to the feed store, grabbed every essential, vitamin paste, specialized newborn formula, electrolytes, and threw his last wad of crumpled bills onto the counter. The clerk, a young woman who knew Karl only as the quiet hermit, looked at the purchases and then at Karl's desperate, unshaven face. "Everything all right, Karl?" she asked gently. Karl just shook his head, unable to speak. "Just gotta go." He sped back, the silence of the truck replaced by the frantic pounding of his heart. When he burst back into the barn, the heat lamp was still glowing, but Lucky was absolutely still. Karl felt his legs almost give out. No. Not again. Karl stumbled back into the barn, the bag of expensive supplies dropping forgotten in the doorway. His heart was a drum of pure dread. Lucky was motionless, absolutely, eerily still. The heat lamp was doing its job. The hay was warm, but the tiny body was unresponsive. "No," Karl whispered, his voice cracking, a sound that hadn't left his throat since that terrible winter morning 15 years ago. "Please, God, no." He rushed to the stall, falling to his knees beside the foal. He pressed his ear to the tiny chest. Silence. Then, a heartbeat, so faint, so irregular, it was barely there, like a tiny bird struggling against a locked cage. But it was there. It wasn't death yet, but it was closer than Karl had ever seen a living thing come without crossing over. The foal was sinking. Its eyes were half open, glazed and unfocused. It wasn't shivering anymore, and Karl knew that was the worst sign. The body had given up on fighting the cold. This time, Karl didn't reach for the formula or the vitamins. He reached for something else. He simply wrapped his large, rough hands around the foal's small head. He started talking, not trying to feed it, not trying to warm it, but just talking. He spoke to it like he used to speak to his wife, Elara, late at night, telling her his worries, his hopes. "Look, boy," Karl said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "I know what it's like, to be so tired you just want to let go, when everything hurts, and the light just ain't strong enough. But you can't. Hear me? You just can't quit." He didn't know if the foal could hear him, but talking helped Karl. It forced the grief to the surface, where he could deal with it, instead of letting it fester inside. He talked about the farm, about the spring planting, about the silly little pony he was going to buy for his son. He poured out 15 years of bottled-up regret right into the cold, silent air of the barn. He tried the specialized paste. He dipped his finger in the formula and rubbed it onto the foal's gums, hoping for some absorption. Nothing worked. The foal was just waiting. The sun started to set again, turning the few dusty windows of the barn into streaks of angry red. It was the end of the third day. Karl looked utterly defeated. His plaid shirt was soaked in sweat and grime. His gray hair was messy, and his eyes had dark rings that looked permanently etched into his skin. He sat back on his heels, the exhaustion finally pulling him down. He looked at the little foal, its head resting on the straw, its small legs stretched out, and he knew it was time to let go. He'd done everything. He'd spent his last money, risked his health, and, worst of all, he'd let his heart hope. And just like before, that hope was failing him. Karl gently picked up the little body and brought it against his chest, tucking it inside his overalls, right over his own slowing heart. He rocked back and forth, slowly, the way a father would rock a tired child. "It's okay," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the wind now howling outside. "You can rest, son. You fought a good fight, better than I ever did." He sat there for what felt like an hour, maybe more, in the total, crushing darkness, just waiting for the final moment. He was finally ready to accept the failure, the quiet confirmation that he truly couldn't save anything. Then, he felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible quiver, not a shudder of pain, but a deep, long breath. The foal's head shifted slightly, nuzzling deeper into the warmth of Karl's chest. It was the only sign of will it had shown all day, a final, desperate attempt to find heat. It was not enough to save it, but it was enough to shatter Karl's resignation. The silence was broken again. But this time, it wasn't from the barn. It was a guttural, desperate sound from outside. A sound of pure, unadulterated motherhood. The sound was elemental. It wasn't the soft, mournful whinny of a farm horse. It was the raw, tearing cry of a wild thing in absolute distress. It slammed through the quiet desperation of the barn, making the weak flame of the hurricane lamp flicker wildly. Karl froze, still holding the tiny, near-lifeless Lucky to his chest. He knew that sound. It was the frantic call of a mare that had lost her foal. He carefully placed Lucky back down in the straw and grabbed the old, heavy-duty flashlight he kept hanging near the door. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, uneven beat. He had spent the last 3 days fighting the shadows of the past. Now he was about to face a very real, very dangerous wild animal. He crept to the main door and slowly slid the heavy wooden bolt. He peered out into the darkness. The early morning was still hours away, and the world was black, save for the weak light filtering from the barn door. There she was. She was massive, a wild mare, coal-black with a dark, matted mane and eyes that reflected the flashlight beam with a terrible, fiery intensity. She was standing barely 20 feet from the barn, right where the old, thick wooden fence line met the main wall. She was moving with a desperate, hobbled energy, circling the enclosure. Karl saw the reason for her delay immediately. Her right hind flank was deeply scored, a long, ugly gash that was still seeping blood into her matted coat. It looked like she had been caught in an old, rusted wire or maybe even a hunter's fence. She hadn't abandoned her foal. She had been trapped, wounded, and forced to recover enough strength just to drag herself back. The wound added a terrifying layer to her desperation. She wasn't just a mother. She was a predator fighting for survival. The mare caught the scent of her foal, or perhaps the man who held it. She stopped her circling and planted her huge hooves, lowering her head and letting out another terrifying, desperate shriek that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Karl's worn boots. She charged. Not at Karl, but at the sturdy, years-old wooden fence that separated her from her child. She slammed her shoulder into the thick pine planks, and the whole structure groaned in protest. Splinters flew into the air. She tried again and again, ignoring the blinding pain in her flank, driven only by the primal need to get inside. Karl realized, with a sickening clarity, that the fence he'd built years ago for sturdy protection was now a barrier of agonizing separation. It was designed to keep things out, and now it was keeping the one thing that could save Lucky out. The old man knew the rules of the wild. If the mare saw him as a threat, she would kill him. He was standing between her and her dying child. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand. He raised his hand slowly, trying to look non-threatening, a foolish gesture against a 1,000-pound animal consumed by rage. "Hey, girl," Karl said softly, his voice barely a breath. "I got him. He's safe, but I can't let you in this way." The mare ignored him, slamming her head against the fence again. She was starting to foam at the mouth, her breathing ragged and frantic. She was hurting herself more than the fence. The wire he had strung along the top for reinforcement, old, rusty stuff, was digging into her neck. Karl had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. If the mare broke through that fence in her frenzy, she would come in like a wrecking ball, crushing Lucky, him, and everything else in her path. He had to let her in, but he had to do it on his terms. He slowly backed away from the barn door, his eyes locked on the raging silhouette of the mare. His gaze went past the animal, to the side of the barn where the fence was connected by a rusted, heavy hinge, a hinge he hadn't moved in a decade. If he could get to the tool shed, if he could find his old axe, he knew he had minutes, maybe less, before the mare succeeded in tearing down the fence in a violent, uncontrolled explosion. He could hear the wood beginning to splinter and crack under her relentless assault. Karl didn't hesitate. Fear was a familiar companion, but the sound of the mare's frantic struggle, the splintering wood, the desperate, guttural cries, drowned out everything else. He knew he had to act. Controlled entrance was the only chance they all had. He sprinted across the yard, slipping on the slick mud, toward the tool shed. The mare barely noticed him. Consumed by her rage at the unyielding barrier, Karl threw open the shed door, grabbed the heaviest tool he could find, his old, battered splitting axe, and ran back toward the fence line, approaching from the side opposite the mare's frenzied assault. He kept his body low and his movements cautious, but quick. He was moving parallel to the furious animal, his eyes never leaving her massive, tensed form. Her ears were pinned back, her nostrils flared. She was ready to attack anything that stood between her and Lucky. Karl was now, undeniably, standing between them. He reached the section of the fence he'd targeted, an old, weathered post that held the whole line together. It was 20 feet from the mare's current position, a dangerous but manageable distance. Karl raised the heavy axe above his head. For a moment, he paused, his chest heaving, listening to the mare's ragged breathing. He looked past the animal, through the dark opening of the woods, and imagined the life he had once been promised, the life he had lost. "This is it," he thought. "This is what I do now." He brought the axe down with a grunt of pure, desperate effort. Crack! The sound was explosive, cutting through the night. The mare reacted instantly. She stopped her own assault, her head snapping up. She let out a fierce, warning scream and wheeled around, fixing her terrifying, fiery gaze directly on Karl. He was exposed, a small, gray man in overalls, holding an axe, standing in the open, threatening her way in. She took one thundering, threatening step towards him, her injured flank shuddering with the movement. "Stay," Karl shouted, the word torn from his lungs. It was an order, not a plea. He didn't sound like a gentle old man anymore. He sounded like a man fighting for his soul. He didn't wait for her to decide. He swung again. Whump! The axe bit deep into the old pine. He had to disable the fence, and fast, before the mare decided he was the easier target. He was in a race against the animal's pain, its rage, and the tiny amount of time Lucky had left. Each swing jarred his old bones, screaming through his shoulders and back. He ignored the pain. He ignored the furious snorts of the mare as she cautiously circled, trying to understand this new threat. She was confused. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to break the barrier she was fighting. With one final, desperate swing, the main post gave way. K-chunk. The heavy post snapped with a horrible tearing sound. The entire section of the fence, about 10 feet wide, sagged downward, leaving a large, gaping hole. The rusty reinforcing wire tore free from the remaining wood, scraping across the mud. Karl stumbled back, dropping the axe in the mud, his lungs burning. He was utterly spent. He looked at the mare. She stopped circling. She stared at the new opening. Her fiery eyes darted from the gap to Karl, standing vulnerable just feet away. She was deciding, does the man live, or does the child? It was a standoff. The fence was down. The choice was hers. The quiet that followed the fence falling? Man, It was heavier than the whole darn axe. Karl and that wild mare were locked in a staring contest, separated by maybe 10 feet of mud and a canyon of different worlds. It was a moment of pure, raw judgment. She was the one who broke the deadlock. Real slow, wincing a bit from the wound on her flank, she lifted that massive front hoof and carefully stepped over the busted-up post. Her whole body was taut, not just from pain, but from being ready to launch into a full-on attack at any second. But her head, her nose, her entire focus was locked onto one thing, the open barn door, where the faint, sick smell of her baby was coming from. Karl knew he had to play statue. He dropped his hands to his sides, palms out, just to say, "I got nothing." If he even thought about moving or reaching out, she'd flatten him. He had to be a piece of the scenery, like a forgotten feed sack. "Go get him, girl," Karl croaked out, his voice so dry it barely made a sound. "He's waiting. I ain't the bad guy." Finally, she made the call. Her fierce gaze didn't leave Karl, but instinct was stronger than suspicion. She dropped her head slightly and, hugging the side of the barn wall, started moving cautiously toward the wide-open door. You could tell every step was costing her. That gash was a nasty one. Karl backed up real easy, shuffling his boots back along the wall until he was tucked into the far corner, nowhere near the entrance. He gave her space. He gave her the benefit of the doubt. She stopped right at the threshold. The faint lantern light inside, which should have looked safe, probably looked like a trap to a wild horse. She let out a soft, questioning sound. It wasn't the scream of anger. It was a low nicker, the sound of a mama calling her kid home. And from inside the fresh hay, there was an answer, a tiny, weak, but unmistakable snort from Lucky. That little foal heard his mom. Whatever life force he had left flared up just from that sound. The mare charged in. Karl couldn't see everything, but he heard it. The soft thump of hooves, ragged breathing, a sudden, loud sniff, and then silence. A perfect, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the mare gulping air. Karl, legs shaking from exhaustion, crept back to the doorway and peeked inside. The mare was standing over Lucky, completely shielding him with her huge body. She wasn't moving, just sniffing, licking, making these low, rumbling sounds that vibrated off the barn walls. It was the oldest ritual on earth, the pure, unfiltered love of a mother, and it was something Karl hadn't allowed himself to witness in years. Then, it happened. Lucky, who had been on his way out just moments before, suddenly, like somebody flipped a switch, found his strength. He wiggled, searching for warmth and life. The mare let out a massive sigh of relief and shifted slightly. Karl saw the foal, for the first time in 3 days, find the teat and start to suckle. Not weak sips, but greedy, strong gulps, the sheer, stubborn will to live. That sound, the swallow 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 of milk in the mare's quiet hush, that was the sound that finally broke Karl. He dropped onto his knees in the muck outside and just covered his face, letting the tears that had been frozen solid for 15 years finally rush out. He hadn't saved the foal. She had. He was just the guy who cleared the junk, who took down the fence so life could rush in. In that moment of humility, of realizing he wasn't the hero, Karl felt something like peace for the first time in forever. The tears didn't last long. Thank God. Karl was too dang tired, too dried out from 3 days of no sleep for a proper breakdown. But those were good tears, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to shake 15 years of frozen sadness right out of him. He stayed right there on the ground, breathing hard, letting the cold air clear his head. It was done. When he finally pulled himself up, he was just a man, not a hero, not a failure, just an old farmer in a dirty pair of overalls. He looked back at the barn. The scene inside was completely still. The lamp threw a weak, golden circle of light onto the straw. The mare had her back completely to him, a big, dark wall of protection around Lucky. He could hear that tiny, rhythmic slurp 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 as the foal drank. It was the best noise he'd ever heard, the sound of life, demanding and stubborn. Karl knew he couldn't leave, not yet, but he couldn't get too close either. He needed to be a presence, not a threat. Real slow, he backed away from the stall, grabbed a clean piece of burlap, and leaned against a heavy support beam right across from the main walkway. He didn't even try to sleep. He just watched. The mare was a vigilant shadow. Every time Karl shifted his weight even a little, her big head would snap up, her ears swiveling like antennae, listening. If Karl coughed, she'd snort a sharp warning. The trust was there, the trust that Karl wouldn't hurt her baby, but the truce was paper thin. He was still one of the bipeds, one of the fence builders. It was strange sitting there, the barn, which had felt like a tomb of death and hopelessness for 3 days, suddenly felt full of life. The air was warm from the mare's huge body heat, thick with the smell of horse and hay and life itself. Karl thought about the axe he'd tossed into the mud. He hadn't just broken a fence, he'd broken his own darn self-quarantine. By risking himself to unite mother and child, he'd finally put life ahead of his paralyzing fear of loss. He realized then that he hadn't saved Lucky for himself or for the memory of Alara. He saved them because it was the right, clean thing to do, and by doing it, they saved him. The black sky outside was starting to turn that sickly lavender color. Dawn was coming. Karl stretched his aching, protesting back, ignoring the groans of his old muscles. He knew what had to happen next. He couldn't keep them. The mare was wild. She needed the woods, a herd, and freedom to heal that bad-looking flank of hers. He had to check on them one last time. He got up slow, careful, moving like a ghost. He crept to the stall and peeked over the partition. Lucky was still suckling, steady and strong. The mare didn't react this time. It was like she knew he was just checking in. Karl cracked a smile, a real one, a pure, sad, beautiful smile that bunched up the wrinkles around his eyes. A smile that hadn't been seen on this farm in 15 years. "You're gonna make it, kid." He turned and headed for the barn door, the rising sun now drawing thin, bright gold stripes through the cracks in the wood. It was time for the final, hardest act, opening that door and letting them both go. He just needed to give them a little more time to bond and let that mare rest. He grabbed his forgotten supplies and quietly stepped out of the barn, closing the heavy door just enough to keep the heat in, but not enough to lock them. He needed to figure out how to help that mare's wound without getting his head kicked off his shoulders. That was the next problem. Karl got back to the house, shaved the 3-day growth off his face, threw on a fresh plaid shirt and clean overalls, figured if he was going to approach a furious, wounded animal, he shouldn't look like a swamp creature. He needed to look calm. He needed to look serious. The first thing he did was grab the heavy-duty wound salve and antiseptic spray he'd bought for the foal. That mare's flank was cut up bad. The deep gash looked like it was from some rusty barbed wire, and it was going to get infected fast. If she got sick, Lucky was done for, and all his sacrifice would be for nothing. He walked back to the barn, moving slow and deliberate. He stopped 10 feet from the door and called out softly, "Hey, girl, I'm just coming to help. You hear me? I ain't gonna hurt you." He sounded firm, not pleading. He slid the barn door open just enough to squeeze through, then slid it shut again. The light was better now, filtering in from the door cracks. The mare was standing over Lucky, who was finally sleeping soundly in the hay, full of his mother's milk. The mare looked tired, her head drooping, but she was still vigilant. Karl didn't approach the foal. He ignored the foal completely. He kept his eyes low, looking at the mare's hooves, showing he wasn't looking her in the eye, the ultimate threat signal in the animal kingdom. He moved like molasses in January, inching toward the mare's injured side. The mare's head snapped up. She flared her nostrils, letting out a sharp, warning snort. Her leg tensed, ready to strike out. She was cornered, hurt, and had her baby right there. She was at her most dangerous. "Easy, Mama," Karl murmured. He gently set down the antiseptic spray far away, where she could clearly see it wasn't a weapon. He held up the salve. "This is gonna help you. It's gonna stop the Hutton. Just let me." He then did something truly insane. He deliberately turned his back slightly to her, exposing himself, showing her he wasn't going to lunge. He started humming a low, quiet, old-fashioned tune his mother used to sing while milking. It was a huge gamble. He was tempting fate. If she struck, he'd be crippled or dead. But he was giving her the ultimate offering of trust. "I trust you not to kill me." He slowly, agonizingly slowly, knelt down near her injured flank. The air was thick with the mare's tension. He could hear her ragged breathing right over his head. Then, the miracle, she didn't move. She stayed absolutely rock still. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the smell of the powerful salve. Maybe, just maybe, it was the sound of the old man's humming and the raw realization that this human had broken the barrier for her. Karl worked fast. He gently ran his gloved fingers over the gash, clearing the dried blood and mud. The mare flinched violently when he touched the wound, but she held her position. Karl talked low and steady, keeping the rhythm of the humming. He spread the thick, golden salve over the length of the wound. It was messy, it was crude, but it was done. It was protected. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, his hands up and empty. He looked at the mare. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked not with fury, but with something akin to acknowledgement. She slowly lowered her head, not in defeat, but in what looked very much like a silent, tired thank you. She nudged her nose against his shoulder, a dry, warm push. It wasn't affection, but it was recognition. Karl reached out his hand, slowly, and gave her a single, firm scratch right between her ears. "You're a good mother," he whispered, a tear slipping down his cheek. "Now go be free." Karl finished up slathering that thick salve on the mare's flank, making sure the whole darn gash was covered. He moved his hands away real slow, letting them hover in the air, showing her he was done. He didn't wait for a thanks or anything. He just stood up, stiff and aching, and grabbed the bucket of murky water he'd brought in earlier. He needed to wash the dirt off his hands, both the mud from the barn floor and the guilt from his soul. He retreated to his corner of the barn, giving the mare plenty of space. She watched him, but this time, the tension was gone, replaced with this deep, weary sense of peace. She nudged Lucky one last time, checking his tiny legs, making sure he was solid. Lucky responded with a little hop, showing off his new strength. The little guy was gonna make it. The sun was fully up now. It wasn't harsh, just soft and golden, the kind of light that makes you feel like everything's gonna be all right. It was time. Karl walked to the big main doors of the barn. These weren't the easy human door he'd slipped through. These were the heavy, double-wide doors, held shut with thick, rusty iron bolts. Opening them felt like the final act of letting go. He reached up and pulled the massive bolts back, the sound of metal scraping metal echoing loudly through the barn. The mare flinched, but she didn't bolt. She trusted the sound now. Karl put a hand on each door and pushed. The doors groaned, protested, and then slowly swung wide open. Whoosh! A tidal wave of bright, clean, early morning sunlight flooded the dark, dusty barn. The light hit the fresh hay, the sleeping foal, and the wild mare, making her coat gleam like polished black marble. It was a spectacular sight, the dark, enclosed struggle replaced by the wide, boundless invitation of the outside world. Karl stood to one side, leaning against the door frame, his plaid shirt and overalls looking sharp in the light. He wasn't blocking the way. He wasn't holding them captive. The gate to his freedom, and theirs, was wide open. The mare took a deep, shuddering breath of the clean morning air. She looked at the light, then back at Karl. She took a slow step forward, sniffing the air, checking for traps, checking for the presence of humans. Her instincts were screaming, "Run!" but her sense of maternal duty was urging her, "Go!" She paused right at the threshold. She turned her head and looked directly into Karl's eyes. It wasn't the fiery look from the night before. It was an intelligence, an understanding that passed between them, a recognition that they had shared a life and death battle and had come out on the same side. It was a silent, profound thank you for the life he'd kept warm and the fence he'd destroyed. Karl just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Go on, now," he whispered, a little emotional catch in his voice. "Go home." She turned away, nudged Lucky with her nose, guiding him. The foal was wobbly, but he was strong. He took his first step out of the barn, into the sunlight, and onto the soft, wet grass. The mare followed, stepping over the threshold with a grace that belied her painful wound. They didn't look back. They didn't owe him anything. Karl watched them cross the yard, moving past the muddy spot where he'd dropped his axe, past the empty horse paddock, and straight toward the dense, welcoming edge of the forest. The mare picked up her pace, moving with a confident, homeward rhythm. The foal struggled to keep up, then found his stride, a tiny, determined silhouette following his magnificent mother. They merged into the shadows of the woods, disappearing completely into the trees as if they had only ever been a dream. The only thing left was the wide open barn door, filled with brilliant, empty sunlight. Karl stood there, watching the sunlight swallow the last bit of shadow where the mare and her foal had disappeared. He waited until the only thing left was the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. He then pushed the heavy barn doors shut, but didn't latch them tight. There was no need to lock things in anymore. The barn was empty, quieter than ever, but the silence didn't feel cold. It felt cleansed. It smelled like pine, clean straw, and the strong, beautiful must of a wild mother who fought like hell for her child. He walked out of the barn and headed toward the house. His steps were different now. He wasn't dragging his feet. There was a lightness to his gait. The sun was warm on his face, and he noticed things. The bright red berries on the holly bush by the porch, the way the frost glittered on the rusty roof of his shed. He hadn't really seen the farm in 15 years. He just lived under its shadow. He stopped dead center in the yard. right where the mare had stood, ready to kill him. He looked down at the mud where he'd thrown the axe. He didn't feel fear. He felt a deep, profound gratitude for that moment of risk, for that pure, scary necessity that had forced him to choose life over safety. He walked over to the horse paddock, the one he'd built for his son. It was still standing, sturdy and heartbreakingly empty. The wood was gray, the chain on the gate was rusty, and the grass inside was long and matted down. It was a perfectly preserved monument to the life that never happened. He paused, his hand hovering over the cold, familiar latch. Every day for 15 years, he'd walked past it, accepting the closure, accepting the failure. But today was different. Today, he'd cleared a path for life. With a deep, shaky breath, Karl grabbed the rusty latch. It squeaked in protest, loud and sharp, as he lifted the heavy chain. Then, he pulled the old wooden gate wide open. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was just an open gate leading to a patch of grass. But for Karl, it was the final, devastating move of surrender. He wasn't sealing life out anymore. He was letting the sun in. He was telling the world, okay, I'm ready for whatever comes next. He stood in the empty paddock, sunlight falling all around him, and he whispered, not to the foal, not to the mare, but to the memory of his wife and son, I'm sorry I waited so long. I didn't want to hurt again, but I see it now. You gotta risk the hurt to find the light. He wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand, the final tears of the ordeal. As he turned to leave the newly opened paddock, he noticed something in the straw near the barn door. He walked over and knelt down. It was a single, tiny, dark curl of horsehair, shed from Lucky's coat, a tiny, insignificant piece of proof. He picked it up, feeling the soft texture between his rough fingers. A small, dark promise. The wild life had left him a souvenir, a reminder that the world was still magical and life was still worth fighting for. He tucked the hair deep into the pocket of his overalls, right over his heart. He looked out toward the woods, no longer seeing a wall of darkness, but a world full of possibility. The old man, the farmer in the plaid shirt, was no longer waiting to die. He was waiting for spring.